Good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Patricia Cranz, Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. Our program tonight is very timely: how journalists are finding ways to evade coverage restrictions, which seem to be getting more and more widespread. Tonight we'll hear from a great group of journalists who find ways around these restrictions. Mohammed Mhawish is a Palestinian from Gaza who's covered the war there from both inside and outside the territory. Nilo Tabrizy is an investigative journalist who's worked extensively with open source material to report on Iran for the Washington Post and the New York Times. She's also a governor of the OPC. Stephen Eisenhammer is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and the Reuters Bureau Chief for Mexico and Central America. He was part of the Reuters team that won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 2025 for the series Fentanyl Express. Stephen is also a three-time winner of Overseas Press Club Awards. Greg Myrie, NPR's national security correspondent, will be the moderator. Greg is also a governor of the OPC. And I'd like to also thank Sandra Stevenson and Amran Abakar, who helped us set up this program. So please put any questions you have in the chat, and Greg will take them up at the appropriate time. So now I hand it over to you, Greg. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks for the great introduction. And we have a wonderful panel with us here this evening. As Patricia mentioned, feel free to start putting questions in at any time, and we promise we'll get to them. Nilu, I'd like to start with you, given the urgency of what we're seeing and not seeing in the war in Iran. As somebody who's trying to cover this from afar, and I understand you're in Canada, near Vancouver right now, what are you seeing? What are you not seeing? How are you seeing? And what do you want to see? Just give us a sense of what you can and can't see.
Sure. So obviously, access is such an issue when it comes to covering Iran. And so, what we rely on are videos that come from eyewitnesses that eyewitnesses take at great personal cost. And so, typically, how this environment, this ecospheres works is that many eyewitnesses take videos. They send them to Telegram channel admins who themselves are these citizen journalists that have 500,000, 600,000, a million subscribers in their channels. They'll send the videos directly to the admins and it'll be shared on Telegram. And then most often, some of those videos, some of the most, egregious ones that might show state violence or civilian casualties, some of those will make their ways onto X, where, a wider range of people will see it because obviously Telegram is a predominantly Persian-speaking environment. But it's been really difficult. I mean, from the first day of the airstrikes, the internet was just completely shut off. And Iranians have been experiencing this. I mean, just the massacre was only a few weeks ago. So Iranians have now spent almost a quarter of the year in complete internet connectivity blackout, which is just unfathomable. So for me, it's difficult to get in touch with my family members, my loved ones, let alone sources. And so what it's looked like for me is my sources who might have other circumvention methods like Starlink might connect every few days, and I'll get drips of information from them. And I'll learn how, state security forces, even under airstrikes, are continuing to suppress people, intimidate people, and tell them to stay home. What we've seen in the last couple days is there's even been an increased crackdown on Starlink as well. So that lid is continuing to tighten, and so it makes it really difficult. And then the other aspect of it as well is satellite imagery. I mean, satellite imagery is so important to our jobs because we'll see, videos of the strike on the school in Minab, for example. Satellite imagery is very helpful because it helps us understand, was this an errant missile that dropped out of the sky, or was this a precision strike gone wrong, an issue of mistargeting? Satellite imagery is what allows us to see, oh, this complex got hit a few times. But now these satellite imagery companies in the US, whose number one customer base or their biggest client might be the Department of Defense, we're getting massive delays on satellite imagery for high resolution imagery. So it went from a 14-day delay to anything in the Persian Gulf. So anything that that might show US positions or allied positions that have been hit by Iran. Then there was a 96-hour delay on high-res imagery coming from Iran itself. And so we've had to figure out other ways, other forms of remote sensing that can provide more evidence to verify videos and to understand more about what we might be looking at.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Mohammed, I'd like you to talk about something, a slightly different challenge. When you were inside Gaza at the beginning of the war there in the fall of October of 23, you were inside, but getting the information out was the big challenge at that moment. Can you take us back to that time, talk about what it was like in Gaza, how you were doing things, just the nuts and bolts. I mean, how are you getting an internet connection? How are you talking to editors? How are you sending out material? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, of course, I think prior to October 7th, I think we've had experience and practice in terms of how to navigate the kind of environment in Gaza, since the kind of the norm was like living under a blockade where access to internet and connection to the outside world was always limited. But starting on October 7th, it was entirely different given the risks and the challenges that started to appear on a daily basis. And so I think what it was like, what it looked like day to day, you wake up, if you slept, and your first thought is how to report a story. um, that's that's just something that you were also living through. It was not, a story that, we were detached from. It was, as journalists and as reporters in Gaza, we were reporting on the same stories and, challenges that we were going through at the same time, along with the people that we were interviewing and talking to. So we were kind of like in the middle between like the witness and the reporter sort of like obligation. And on top of that, there was like the logistical kind of operational aspect of how that challenge was navigated. Um,
How is it?
Getting
Yeah,
on the internet
how
was
are you just getting an internet connection? How are you transmitting your material? And tell you were working with Al Jazeera at that time, correct?
it was an all-time challenge to get to find the internet connection and signal across Gaza at the time. I was based in Gaza City, and we were looking around to see the buildings that were least destroyed, the buildings that had connection towers still standing and intact on it. We were able to just be able to look for a way to get the equipment charged, to be able to connect to the internet wherever it felt safe. Having the phone and the SIM cards at the time, it was an extra layer of a challenge, because as reporters we thought these were ways like where actually were tracked and marked and targeted. So we were trying to avoid the kind of Wi-Fi connection. We thought eSIM cards, like the electronic SIM cards on the phone, were a viable option as well, but it was also risky at the same time. We were always trying to navigate connection away from telecoms companies that were not operating from inside Israeli territories. That was one thing. The other was like we were trying to get connection through satellite um, phones, and that was also a challenge because equipment inside Gaza, it was not really available at that point for everyone. Including just as
Just to drive that home, I mean, there is this double-edged sword that you're alluding to. It's like you want to find the place where you can communicate, but that also means it's easier for the Israelis to track. If you're seeing some place that has a working cell tower and a good connection, that might also
exactly.
either be a target or a way to track you, and that obviously was a life and death concern.
It was true indeed. I mean, at some point there was a sense of desperation because no matter what we tried, at the end of the day, there was no way to escape that matrix. I mean, we were always in the radar, and there was no way to escape the kind of watching from the military and to report a story that was entirely safe. So it was through the traditional kind of Wi-Fi connection. Whenever we had that available, it was either the SIM cards or the electronic SIM cards, because it was really hard to get physical cards at the time and keep switching between phones, or the satellite phones that were available and provided by the network to some level across parts in Gaza. And there were moments where we could, find ourselves connected to the internet through phones and, cellular data that was available to some other colleagues and peers on the ground, where we could be able to connect to each other and just, file the stories, maybe sometimes through the voice command option on the phone, because like, you're always on the move, you're always running, and you're always on the, hunt for a story to keep us, to keep the world informed, to keep the world connected to the situation and what's happening. And at the same time, it was as risky for you as a journalist there, navigating that kind of logistical challenge while also trying to stay safe. And one of the strategies that people, including myself, we would do back there is, whenever we had the internet connected through like the conventional methods of, providers, modems, routers, anything that was, publicly available, we were not, using that and file stories while we were inside with families and homes and with our loved ones and friends and, maybe neighbors or the places we would shelter at. So one of the things that, if we had internet available through these publicly available channels that survived bombardment and strikes, we would try to avoid, being around public, around neighbors, around friends and, family, so that if any kind of targeting happens, if any kind of monitoring or tracking happens for the reporter or the story that's coming out, it would be with the least kind of damage possible. So that was one of the things that, we did the math for on the spot.
Right. Stephen, you and your Reuters team did these incredible stories that won the Pulitzer Prize last year for the fentanyl trail coming from the chemicals in China to Mexico and onto the United States. Walk me through the first conversation you had with Reuters security people. I just see their heads exploding when you tell them what you're going to do. You're going to get fentanyl chemicals from China. You're going to talk to cartels in Mexico and lay out this whole pathway of how fentanyl starts in China and makes its way to the US. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, and the lawyers as well, the security team and the lawyers. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big challenges there was trying to obviously keep our team safe, the people that we're talking to, these sellers in China, and we did that through a couple of different ways. Initially we were using Tails operating systems on burner laptops, so basically stuff that was entirely disconnected from any system, certainly from the Reuters system, and
And who are you talking to? People in China who could.
So we would find numbers through the dark web. So yeah, on the dark web, you'd be able to find sellers that we then talk to through encrypted messaging services like Telegram or through WhatsApp and things like that. One of the kind of crazy things of that story is that we'd initially kind of built this kind of digital security system and going in through the dark web, and very quickly found that actually you could find a lot of these sellers just on Google, just on the normal internet. And so we ended up finding quite a lot of these sellers just through Google image searches, and then you would contact these sellers via WhatsApp or whatever it was, and pay for it in Bitcoin and get it delivered. And it would just arrive in packages about this size. We'd order like a kilo. And yeah, we had them delivered both in the US and here in Mexico City.
And you were identifying yourself as being from Reuters. Were you identifying yourself by name or just by company, by Reuters? And or were you being a little cagey at any points along the way?
We basically didn't volunteer any information in terms of kind of who we were. We didn't we neither lied as to who we were, and we didn't volunteer it either. But when we started to think about where we would have the stuff delivered, that was when we started to kind of have quite a lot of questions around. We didn't want to have it delivered to anyone's house. We were basically quite careful about. We were worried about individual journalists being identified through this process and maybe being kind of mistaken for being cartel members or something like that. And so in the end, the decision in Mexico was made that the safest place was to have it delivered to the Reuters office. So there we did decide that it was safer to kind of receive it as Reuters the company as opposed to an individual at their home address or whatever. And the Reuters address is just on one of the main avenues, a high-rise building, main avenues in Mexico City. And it was trying to get that balance between keeping our journalists safe, but then also not disguising everything so much that we really came across as criminal actors in this. So we wanted, particularly getting a sent to the Reuters address, to make it kind of, if someone had wanted to look up, who was buying it, it would become pretty clear that it was a news organization.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And did you always get what you ordered, or was it
Most of the time, but we got ripped off quite a few times. There was one case, where we had stuff sent to the US, and so we would receive the stuff, then we would get it tested at like a labs that have all this kind of really fancy, testing equipment to figure out what it was, so that we could really say it's definitively this fentanyl precursor or that. And so we had this kind of white powder arrive in the US, send it to the fancy lab, do all the tests on it, and these chemists just could not figure out what it was, and they spent ages coming back and forth and saying we don't know what it is. And in the end, it turned out to be sugar. So that we just used gone through all of this complicated purchasing just to get some sugar that we could have bought around the corner. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Okay.
it's
So
it's a criminal marketplace,
not an entirely honest business is what I'm hearing here.
No.
Hold that thought. We'll follow up on that. Nilu, is a kind of a related question. How do you confirm authenticity? Or even let's back up one step further. You were born in Iran. Tell us when you left and when the last time was you were back in Iran.
I left when I was in preschool, so I grew up most of my life in Canada, and the only time I went back was in a summer when I was 10 or 11 to meet cousins that I had never met my whole life. So yeah, I've grown up most of my life here.
Could you theoretically go back, or would you immediately be identified as a journalist and not allowed to go back?
Yeah, they typically, the Islamic Republic has a playbook of hostage taking, and people who are dual nationals, particularly people with high, not even I'm saying I'm high profile, but I'm somewhat Googleable, right? So that could be an important bargaining chip to them. I think what happened to my colleague Jason Rezaian at the Post was a warning for all of us that there's just no way to operate safely as a journalist in Iran, even if you're accredited. Or I look at my friends who are journalists for fantastic domestic papers in Iran, and they're under so much pressure. One friend of mine tweeted after the former President Raisi was killed in a helicopter accident, and just tweeted he was not a martyr, and immediately security services were at their door. Or as we saw, I mean, if you're an accredited journalist in Iran, you're a foreign journalist, you typically can't leave Tehran. It's very difficult to be able to leave the capital. You're highly minded. So it's a very stressful environment to do work in the country.
Yeah. And so tell us how you authenticate the videos that you're seeing, and also preserving the anonymity of the people sending those videos, and the geolocation, how and give us some sense of how many videos you were seeing, say, before the January protests and then during the January protests, and how much you're seeing now.
Yes, I mean, open source reporting is really the best way that we can report on Iran and do accountability-based reporting, but safely. So when I see a video that's, interesting to me, so the Minab school, I'll take that for example. That was on the first day. I was one of the first people to locate it on the internet. Just do want to say that. And so what you do with it is I saw this video, and then I would try to figure out, okay, let me find the coordinates of it. How can I make sure that it's authentic? So the first thing I do is I take screenshots in several parts of the video, the beginning, middle, end, and I'll reverse image search those to make sure that this is a current video, because very often in protest rounds, they'll say, this is of the current moment, but it's not if you do a little bit of research. So I did that check first, and I felt very comfortable. And then the next step was to locate it so I could understand more about why was the school hit. And so I started talking to some journalists or citizen journalists that got the video first and just asked them, do we know anything about it? And they said, all we know that is it's a school in Minab. So then I just started looking around on Google Earth. Minab is a small town in Hormozgan province, a little bit inland from the Strait of Hormuz. And I was just able to match up the features that I saw. So things like there's shrubbery around the school that I was able to match that. There was a pattern on the curb that was this kind of striped pattern. So I was able to match that. It's just a practice called georeferencing. What features can I reference to other existing material? And so I felt really comfortable again after spending probably an hour. I was able to locate it because I had a tip that it's in this town and it's a smaller town. So it was a little bit easier to do. I've spent 3 days on a video as well. Sometimes it can take a long time. So I remember during the Woman Life Freedom protests, I was looking at Sistan Balochistan in the southeast in Iran, and I was looking at an incident that happened in the town of Khash, where state security forces opened live fire on unarmed protesters. And I saw this video that was really important because it showed a automatic, machine gun style rifle mounted on a truck. Those are, extremely deadly. So I thought this is really important because we need to verify this because it shows the level of lethality, which security forces are approaching people. I saw this and then I saw a highway overpass and I naively thought, how many highway overpasses could there be? This town is filled with highway overpasses. So then I had to look at other things. I saw a mountain range in the background. So I went to this fantastic website called PeakVisor, where you can see geographic features and be able to map it that way. But that took me 3 days. Like I tried, and then I was just like, I feel insane. I'm going cross-eyed. I can't look at this anymore. So it just took me really 3 days of going back and forth with that video. So it really depends. Sometimes it can be really easy. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes you're not able to verify it. Sometimes people will film, especially during the massacre that we saw in January. There was a lot of video that people posted that was important, showing civilians after they were shot on the ground, bleeding out, really graphic footage. But I can't verify that. If it's a tight shot and all I see is someone's body, like that, there's just not enough information. So there are important videos that that we can't use. And typically the way people film videos, an action happens and then they start filming it. It's not often that we see the moment of impact. With the Minab school, for example, as we were all trying to figure out what type of munition was it, who was responsible for it. A really key piece of evidence that we saw was a missile that many munitions experts have said most likely it's a Tomahawk missile, which the US is the only party in this conflict that has access to this munition. We saw the point of impact, not at hitting the school. As we learned, this was multiple strikes. The school was hit first. But then, but it makes sense, right? An impact happened. People are there, they're filming, and then we just got lucky, really, as viewers, to see the missile hit the second site. And so that's really important in trying to establish exactly who was responsible for what. It's those moments of impact that is extremely important.
And is this something you can do by yourself, but it may take 3 days? Or is this a group project where you could say, hey, I've got this image, but does somebody else have something similar, something so we can piece this together, so we can confirm this is the spot, so I could see a little before this incident happened or a little bit after? But does that, again, start opening people up to potential detection by a government?
Well, what's really interesting is the open source community. Like we're all really active on X, and a lot of people, I verified this, and as well at the same time, Chris Osek, who's an independent researcher in the Netherlands, verified it. So did Nemo Amo, someone else who's a very prolific geolocator. And so this is a community that's very based on transparency, right? We show each other exactly how we georeferenced it. We have our screenshots, and we'll even all be chatting amongst ourselves. So we actually do info share with each other. And again, it's mostly people that are doing it outside the US. There's a fantastic Persian language fact-checking site that started out very recently, a few months ago, called Factname. They're wonderful. So they're starting to do open source, visually led, investigations and doing it in the Persian language, which is such a great service to, Persian speakers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mohammed, let's talk a little bit about what you were facing then as the war began in Gaza. What were your biggest challenges? And again, talk a little bit more about this dual nature. It's not like you are coming in to cover a story. You're of this place. How did the risk to you and your family increase as the war went on and you started to get a sense of what could happen to journalists in Gaza, and even I gather you heard directly from the Israelis?
Well, yes, of course. It was I think there is a tendency, I think, in, when people hear that it was just deadly and fatal for journalists there to, customize their lives to, the pattern and the level of, danger and risk that surrounded every part of the job in Gaza, starting on the morning of October 7th, particularly, but of course, a little bit of, going back in history with that. Anyone who was a journalist in Gaza, anyone who had been like through 2014, 2021, we had this kind of understanding of how quickly things might escalate and the need for having a place where we can call it shelter or a place where we can just seek safety away from the troubles and the challenges of filing stories and assignments. Um, you know, we were dealing with, we saw journalists and friends and colleagues had been killed, in their offices and, in their homes and buildings that, were basically struck while they were sleeping with families. So there was even journalists for Reuters, for Al Jazeera, who were targeted simply for doing the job. And so when, October happened and the scale became clear within the first hours, the volume of strikes and then, the targets and the pace of all of that, people started thinking and making a decision that, was with full knowledge that we knew that flak, jacket doesn't, stop a building from coming on top of us. It was just actually functioning exactly the opposite. It was not a protection. It was more of like, a red target, a red mark on our back. And so, we know the drones are over there. We're not going to be able to escape that. We know the military is on, onto every sort of like, part of the job. They have, the data, they have, the records, they have the file, and they can be tracking people, whatever they are.
But Mohammed, direct to the point, they called you, correct? And
That's absolutely correct. Yes, I myself, I had been away covering, away from home for a week prior to December 7th, 2023, which was like, 2 months into the war then. When I was, I went back home on the evening of December 6th, around 7:30 in the morning when I received this phone call from a no caller ID, somebody that was not identified in my phone. And when I picked up, it was this person who identified themselves as, David from the Israeli military. And he was ordering me to evacuate along with my family and leave the house. Something in that phone call, as risky and as serious as it was, I didn't think that he was really up to that, kind of seriousness level to actually bomb the house, because I thought this is somebody who's actually concerned about me, somebody who's asking me to leave the house. But at the same time, it didn't make any sense that they were actually going to bomb it. And so we stayed. Next morning, the house was bombed. And in that kind of phone call and the messages that, preceded it for weeks before that bombing, they made it explicitly clear that it was actually because of the work and the journalism and the stories we were filing, and I was myself reporting at that, moment in Gaza myself. They were citing bylines from those stories. They were citing, sources that I had interviewed, places I had been, places I had sheltered on, colleagues I know, people in my team where I reported with, who were involved in a way or another in the production act of that story. And so these threats and these texts and calls escalated all the point till December 7th when the house was bombed.
and Mohammed, just tell us what happened in that attack, though, in terms of your family members and the house itself.
It was it was a three-story building in Gaza City in in a neighborhood called the Daraj neighborhood. The house was like really full of people at that point. I was on the second floor. We had family, extended and immediate family, members sheltering in there. We had friends and neighbors who had fled from different parts in the city because at that point the military operation was just undergoing and the Israeli military was penetrating deeper into the city. And so people from eastern parts in the city, like Ashijaya neighborhood and other, neighboring parts and areas there, they had fled, southward into the heart of the city. So it was almost 30, it was around 30 people at that point in the house. And so including children and elderly people. And so there was no way we could, evacuate the house then for a number of reasons, even if we wanted to. It was evening, it was 6:30 in the evening, almost 7. And all we could hear outside was the drones and the sounds of machine guns on the road. And so it was risky to put ourselves in that kind of exposure under the drones. And the closest shelter where we to evacuate and exit the house was like 30 minutes away, and we had to walk. There was no way to get a transport. And so we couldn't do that. We decided to stay, and we thought maybe this person is, threatening me because of my work, but they're not going to bomb the house. We thought that, they're making a message explicit and typical and direct, as a journalist, to me, that they were just trying to silence me and shut me down and scare me off and just let me stop the work I was doing. And at that point, yes, I was really scared. And I thought, I'm going to make a promise to myself. I'm not going to be reporting for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm going to stay home, not going out, not going to be following any stories. Little did I know he was that serious. He was really actually threatening to literally bomb the house, and they did that next morning around 7:30 in the morning, on the morning of December 7th. We had to deal with immediate injuries and really serious injuries at that moment, but we were under this collapse of the medical system in Gaza City, and so there was no space for us to be hospitalized, and all we were offered was first aid treatment. And so we were sent back to stay at a neighbor's place where we had to deal with the recovery and the aftermath of the attack. And then a few days later, we had to get on the run because the military was just making its way closer to where we were staying, and we had to look for a way to escape that danger and look for a place that
was
felt
the house
relatively safer.
is the house been inhabitable since then?
It has been inhabitable only once by, because it had to be, somebody had to, seek some safety in there. Family members and friends who contacted me seeking, the house was partially destroyed, but it was also, there were parts in it that were uninhabitable. Right now it's empty. It's on the verge of collapse, so it is really dangerous for anybody to stay inside or seek safety or shelter in there. Right now it is empty. There is nobody in there. It's almost in ruins, all of it, the 3 stories. But shortly after that, the city had received a number of military operations and strikes that were surrounding the place where we were lived, and all of that, the house was exposed to all of it, and it got more and further damage and destruction since then.
Yeah, I understand. No, I'm very sorry. I know it was an incredibly tough period and still is. Stephen, I'd like to come back to you and pick up where we left off a couple moments ago. You were dealing with getting the precursor chemicals, but that was one aspect of this story. There was another that involved direct contact with some cartel members. How do you arrange something like that and do it safely?
Yeah, I think that was one of the key things we were trying to do was to really get an insight into the whole supply chain. So one part of it, as you say, was talking to people selling this stuff in China and getting delivery of that and making sure it was what they'd said it was and wasn't sugar, etc. And then the other part was to try and understand what the cartels, what it looks like on the kind of receiving side here in Mexico, and the production of fentanyl, turning those precursors into fentanyl. So we did that through a combination of things. Some of it was done on the ground in Sinaloa, talking to cartel members. And my colleague Drazen Georgic was the one doing that. And yes, that was mostly done through contacts that we have and through a fixer as well, who has contacts in Sinaloa, and a relationship with the cartel. That we were able to get some of those interviews where we could really understand how they were using those precursors to make fentanyl.
And again, is that something that is this something you can do one time or a very limited way, or is it something that you're covering that story, the cartels, on an ongoing basis? Is this something that you said, okay, we did it once, that's it, we're not going to push our luck? Or is it something you tried to do in other ways, covering the story as it moves on?
Yeah, no, it's something. I mean, it's something it always each one of those trips takes a huge amount of planning, a huge amount of risk assessment. We tend to try and do it, in and out in a pretty fast way. You're really not spending, you're spending as little time on the ground as possible. But it is something that we try and do. Regular is too strong a word, but it's not something we try and do once, because understanding the situation on the ground, understanding uh trying to get access to inside the cartels and understand what they're doing and how they're thinking is really important. And not it means that you're not relying entirely on law enforcement, whether that's US law enforcement or Mexican law enforcement. So getting that kind of other side of that, it is important, even though it's incredibly hard to do. And it really depends also on the cartel, like CJ&G, for example. El Mencho was just recently captured. Historically have kind of zero relationship with journalists ever. It's a very, very hard cartel to get inside at all. Sinaloa cartel traditionally has a slightly different relationship with reporters. And obviously, El Chapo famously kind of met with Sean Penn and stuff. I mean, there's a interest within the Sinaloa cartel to get out some of their story. And so it's still very difficult, but there are kind of ways that you can arrange interviews or talk to at least certain members of the Sinaloa cartel.
Uh-huh. Mexican journalists have been trying to cover it and being killed for many years. Any change in that? Are they still trying to do very challenging stories? And is it any safer or more dangerous? Any change in what we've heard for many years on that front?
It's still incredibly dangerous. I mean, I think it's and the really difficult thing about the kind of drug war in Mexico is that certainly in terms of victims and violence, the people that really bear the brunt are local reporters. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is also the types of stories that they often do. A lot of the journalists that have been killed in Mexico are kind of local reporters reporting on very local stories. The connection between organized crime and local politics, like for example, the mayor of the town where they might run a blog or a small newspaper or a media site, and they've managed to expose, corruption and links between organized crime and the local politics in that town. And those are incredibly important stories. But unbelievably dangerous stories to do. Where you're naming people and at that local level, and a lot of the journalists that have been killed have been doing those kinds of stories. And it continues to be an incredibly dangerous place to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I'm sure. Understood. Nilo, I want to talk a little bit about the satellite companies that provide photos to journalists. I think you touched on that earlier. And we have a question from Bill Holstein, and I'll mention to everybody in our audience, feel free to put in questions. We're getting to the last 20 minutes or so. And he's saying there are some reports today that the Trump administration is trying to crack down on companies that help journalists analyze satellite imagery. Have you heard anything about either this latest report or just any change in the way these satellite companies have been operating when it comes to photos from Iran since the war began?
Right. I mean, this is a problem that even precedes Iran because, the two main satellite imagery companies that most newsrooms use are Vantor and Planet. And they're great. Planet even will engage with independent reporters and provide imagery for research. Like they really understand the mission. Part of it is, as I mentioned at the top, for Vantor and I'm not sure with Planet, but I do know for Vantor, one of their top clients is the Department of Defense. And we ran into this problem. I don't know what is time last year when we were reporting on the presence of Israeli military in southern Lebanon. Satellite imagery companies told us, well, we can't actually show you, we can't provide this imagery because we're not able to show you the position of U.S. troops or allies of the U.S. And so that absolutely affected our reporting. We're seeing that with Iran play out now too, right? So as Iran started to, in the beginning of these strikes a couple of weeks ago, started to retaliate by hitting, U.S. bases and other targets in the Gulf, some of the U.S. bases, we started to see there was a delay. Then they said, now we're only going to provide imagery after 14 days. And that's high resolution imagery that is so sharp that you can, see exactly what was hit or count how many pieces of aircraft have been hit on a runway, for example. That's really helpful in our reporting. It helps us understand how successful was Iran at hitting these targets. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand from the satellite company's point of view, the Department of Defense is their client, but also they'll say things like, well, Iran could continue to use this intelligence if it's disseminated and reporters put it out there. These are their arguments, but it makes our job really difficult. And now we're even seeing a 96-hour delay of imagery coming from Iran. And that we need that. Like if the US struck Kharg Island, which is 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, we need to see that imagery. We need to see exactly what terminals were destroyed, and it helps us make sense of what happened. So this is absolutely a huge issue. I didn't deal with it personally with Russia and Ukraine, but I heard this was also an issue for some of our colleagues looking at that conflict. But yeah, with Iran, it started very, very quickly.
So yeah, just I'm doing the math in my head here. So it's basically a 96-hour delay from Iran these days. So
Yes.
if President Trump announced, I believe on Friday night, that Kharg Island had been hit, so Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So have you seen any imagery of Kharg Island being hit, or do
There's
you expect
other
to see it
forms.
about
Yeah.
now?
There's other forms of imagery. So the high resolution imagery is what we're not able to access. That's being able to see things really clearly. There's other things that we can do in remote sensing. There's free satellites like Sentinel, Copernicus, these other things that are out there, but they don't show us like details very clearly, but you can put specific bands, specific lights, for example, specific colors, for example, that can show, oh, this place was destroyed, but I may not be able to see precisely which buildings. But there are other things available to reporters, but we just don't get that clear, crisp imagery as fast as we want it. And that's a huge, huge challenge for us. I was doing a training last year at The Hague and doing an advanced open source training. And something one of our trainers said was, this is a problem that they run into as well. There's a number of Chinese satellite companies. They're not bound by the same contracts, right, that the US is, but we don't have access to those. And so it'll be really interesting to see what this next phase of imagery might look like, what companies might step in, or will we continue to see? I mean, frankly, it is a form of censorship, even though we can understand why certain companies will have this. It censors our work as reporters, and it limits our access to information.
Right. And just a quick follow-up. If you're a freelance journalist and you want to talk to one of these companies, as you said, it sounds like they're, depending on the case and various circumstances, but they might be very willing to help. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm freelance now. I've been working doing different stories with New Lines magazine at the moment. Planet has been really lovely. We might ask them for imagery, and we might even say, like, we won't publish this, but we just want to look at it for our reporting in order to do the analysis. Planet is very generous. They've been very generous in my experience in these last few weeks.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mohammed, I want to go back to when you had to make a very hard decision about whether to stay in Gaza or leave Gaza. As we've noted, you're in New York now, but you faced a very hard decision. Tell us a little bit about what went through your thought process and how you left Gaza.
It was not a decision that I was really planning to make, and when I had to make that, it was not, such an easy one, honestly. It was a place where I was born and raised. It is a place where I loved and where I studied, where I had as a journalist, my first ever assignment where I was, navigating how to, figure out life in the midst of everything that was going on. And so in April 2024, I have arrived at that point where I couldn't continue to do my job safely the way I wanted to do it. It was no longer feasible. It was no longer viable for me to keep holding both the story and my life at the same time. And it was clear to me by those threats and escalations to, that were directed my way through the Israeli military, that I could not continue to operate safely as a journalist. And I was still under the radar, even though I had been targeted a few months before that. So they made it clear to me that, through a number of text messages and phone calls, even after we survived the bombing on the house after December 2023, that I was still being watched. And they explicitly said that you survive the first strike, you're not going to survive what's coming next for you. And so at that point, I had to consult with family and be like, this is not going to be safe for me or for anybody here. And so I think there is a plan that we have to follow, which is leaving Gaza, evacuating through the Gaza City all the way south, and then exiting through Rafah to Egypt through the Rafah crossing. At that point, the Israeli military had not yet um, made its way into Rafah, and it didn't have actual control on the crossing. Like they didn't have physical control over the Rafah crossing because, like, the military tanks raided Rafah, and they actually shut down and sealed the crossing on May 7th, 2024. I left in April 2024, so it was 1 month before the military invaded Rafah. And on my way exiting Gaza, on my way evacuating, I had to go through the military checkpoint, which was called the Netzarim checkpoint. It was a military base for the Israeli military where they split the strip in half, the north and the south, and I had to make my way through that, checkpoint. Although it was such an enormous kind of a challenge there, because I was making my way out and showing myself to the very same people who wanted to kill me a few months before. And so I was picked up at that checkpoint. I was split from my family, and I was held into interrogation and questioning in that military base for 4 hours, where I didn't know what was happening to me or my family. I was denied access to um, food. I was denied access to legal consultation. I was denied access or communication with anybody outside. I was interrogated and questioned, and they did not make it clear that I'm going to be permitted exit at some point. But still, eventually, they were like, "You're free to go, and you're good to keep moving." And so that decision was not any easier at that point. Once we crossed the north of Gaza, there was no way to, go back in there. It was a one-way kind of journey where people were encouraged and forced technically to move and make their way, to the south. Basically because the north was like in a place of that unsustainable kind of humanitarian condition. The medical system had collapsed in there. People didn't have access to medical treatment. They didn't have access, to enough food and nutrients and supplies, into, any kind of life-sustaining necessities. So people were asked to move to the south, and once we made our way there, I had contacted a number of friends and colleagues on the other side of the border, including people in the US and Egypt and some Arab states, that coordinated the mobility of us through the Rafah crossing, and facilitated our exit through the crossing into Egypt, where we arrived in
let's
there.
just note was not cheap, and it was not an official
No.
service charge. It was, you had to pay a large bribe to the Egyptians.
It was basically a coordination job with the Egyptian authorities that were in control of the crossing on the other side of the Rafah crossing, on the Egyptian side. And I think the entity that was in control of the crossing, that back then, it was the Egyptian military. But from the Gaza side, I think it was officers that belonged to the government in Gaza that worked and operated under the direction of the Hamas government back then. And so these people were in charge of letting people out and facilitating entry. But the evacuees, the people who wanted to leave and flee, they had to coordinate their own exit through these channels and submit the paperwork and the money to the Egyptian authorities, and then wait for approval for something that we call security coordination, which means if you have approval to leave, then you're good and cleared by the Egyptian authorities to cross into Egyptian soil. If you were not, then you were deemed a security threat and you had to stay in Gaza. There were a number of people who were able to, provide the funding to pay the payments that were, enormously, like they were huge, extraordinary amounts of money. And at that point, it was $5,000 per person. And so when I left with my wife and my toddler, who was 2.5 at the time, we had to pay $15,000 only to cross the border into Egypt. And then once we're there, we were stamped entry visas on our passports and our Palestinian passports that allowed us to stay temporarily in Egypt as evacuees. And that's when I started coordinating. As soon as I left Gaza and settled into Cairo, I started working on the evacuation papers through the same process exactly that I went through, but for my parents and sister who were still trapped in Gaza. And I managed to evacuate them only mere hours before the operation in Rafah started.
Wow, wow. Incredibly harrowing story from start to finish, Mohammed. I would like to put a question to Stephen, but I'd like all of you to chime in on this here in the last 10 minutes or so that we have. Talk to me about how you all are using AI, if in particular you're using it on any difficult or challenging stories that we've been discussing, or just even in general terms. What impact or what effect is it having? Stephen, let's hear from you first.
Um, the question of the moment. Um, so I could probably answer this kind of in two parts. I think the first part is that in some ways AI doesn't change anything, in the sense that when you're talking about being on the ground, when you're talking about trying to access places that are difficult to access, getting information, whether that's from, the local population in Sinaloa who are in the middle of an intra-cartel war, or from cartel members. Really, this is real proper shoe leather reporting. This is not something that AI is replacing. Um, and it becomes ever more important, I think, in a moment where you have so much digital information and where you have the kind of power of AI. So I think that's the kind of my initial response. I mean, we do use it. We do increasingly use AI, particularly for large documents and things like that.
Do you have an example that you could think of?
Yeah, I mean, just for court decisions or court files or things like that. I mean, AI is just incredible at being able to summarize those kinds of documents. You might have like a 150-page case file, right? And its ability to summarize that and also switch between languages. So you might have something, a kind of Spanish language case file in kind of legal jargon Spanish, really hard to read, really hard to understand. You feed that through different AI programs, and it will give you a one-page summary in English. So that kind of stuff is incredible. So I think it definitely kind of it becomes part of your arsenal for investigative journalism, but isn't going to replace the importance of being on the ground.
Any debates that are going on in Reuters or with fellow journalists about, well, yeah, we could do this with AI and it would help, and people saying, no, that's not something we should be doing with AI. Where are you on that debate?
I think we're pretty all in at Reuters. I think, from pretty early on, we're part of Thomson Reuters, the parent company, which has also been really big on AI and uses it for a lot of its legal clients and accounting clients. And I think we've been pretty keen and put a lot of money into creating AI tools that we can use for our journalism, and being very much encouraged to use it. And it's definitely it already is and will continue to be a huge help. But I think that, yeah, as I was saying, that kind of the human intelligence and human information, that continues to be like the engine, right, for a lot of this reporting.
And Nilo, what about you?
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, Stephen. It can't replicate at all what we do, but sometimes it makes things faster. I mean, when you're talking about documents, when we worked on the Native American boarding school investigation at the Washington Post, we had hundreds of documents of enrollment records, old newspaper clippings, and some of these old records that we used were all written in handwriting, which will just increase my astigmatism if I look at it too much. And so we would just upload all of these documents onto Google Pinpoint. That made it really so much easier for us just to search and learn more, because we were trying to confirm the deaths of young students at boarding school. So Google Pinpoint was great. It helped us just kind of go through and be able to keyword search handwriting, which was such a game changer in being able to speed up this process. So that was helpful. What I do see, I mean, we there's so much, AI videos being shared, especially in right now during the context of the war. Some people do really great jobs at debunking it. Shayan Sardarizadeh at BBC Verify. Shayan is amazing. He'll walk through why something is manipulated. I mean, we even saw it last summer in the airstrike on Evin prison. An Israeli politician shared this video. And at the outset, for anyone who, works with video in a forensic manner and who, has training or looks a lot at it, it looked fake to me immediately because it just was, black and white, the front gates of Evin. This politician said, we hit Evin, and it hit it was a big explosion, but a skinny little tree in the background moved barely like this. And that's just simply not what you would see from a blast wave, but it spread like wildfire. So I see that a lot. And it really, again, highlights the importance of video verification in this time. But again, it's just like for me, in terms of geolocating, georeferencing, AI has helped a little bit, but it's such a human process because you do need to be looking at imagery yourself and comparing it with other data points. So it's still a very, like, doing the work is very human coded. And
it seems like it's going to make your job all the more important, but also much harder too, because you're gonna have a lot more information to work with, especially visually, but just confirming what's real and what isn't is also going to get much harder.
Absolutely. And what I saw a lot, especially during the massacre, is I saw AI manipulated imagery and video. So photos that were real, I saw AI enhanced. So there was a photo of a woman at the morgue in Zak morgue, really horrible footage of just dozens of body bags. And I saw one image that was real, which was a woman with, staring in the crowds of these body bags, and there were people in the background. And then I saw the AI version shared, which just dramatized it. It added more rows of body bags and removed people. And it just really made me question, just like, why do we do this? The image itself is already horrible enough. Why are we enhancing it even more? And so I think it's helpful in those moments for us to be critical and to think about why these manipulated images and videos are spreading as well.
Mohammed, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think I remember, covering the war from the ground. I don't remember we had that kind of luxury to sit with the internet and be able to access this kind of technicality, given this the pace and the intensity of everything that was happening at such a speed level. Information was coming in at such a level that we didn't really had any control over. The job was really massive in terms of verification and fact checking and double sourcing and being able to talk with people and at the same time writing the story while we're also witnessing another bombing or another attack that is being happening in place. So I don't, personally speaking, I can't really remember a time where I had refuge for an AI service that was that at least made my job easier at that point. But I think after leaving Gaza, there is this kind of technicality and the level of assistance that AI might conservatively offer, accessing this, huge clouds of data and information that might be necessary for the reporting at some point to some extent. But then again, as Nilo and Stefan said, you have to do the human kind of job due diligence at the end of the day, just to make sure reporting is credible and authentic and being truthful and factual and truth-based and actually well sourced to the point that is really defensible and bulletproof. AI doesn't have that kind of potential, and I don't think it will, because at the end of the day you have the kind of human level and the intelligence of people who belong to the craft and who have spent years and decades just mastering the kind of ability of engaging with this kind of field and profession in a way that is unprecedented. And when you're able to do this kind of level of skill and analysis and human thought to this job, it's really hard to manufacture it elsewhere with any sort of level of machine intelligence or supposedly
Mohammed,
smart thing. Yeah.
One final question. We're down to our final couple minutes here, but I wanted to ask you, you're in New York now, looking at Gaza long distance. Tell us what that looks like from New York and how you're able to communicate with people in Gaza these days. Have communications gotten better since the ceasefire was announced last October, though obviously there's still levels of violence and very limited reconstruction and repairs underway? But just give us a sense of what it's like.
It's that part of the job is where my emotional kind of connection swoops in. It's just like, seeing a place where I, call home, being under that kind of, you know, um, challenges, only to sustain a sense of normalcy, only to provide a sense of, quiet and calm and peace and stability and security for the people who have yearned for that for so long. And at the same time, I'm sitting here reporting on stories that feel thousands of miles away, although I was the same person who lived through these stories one day. And I mean, reporting on the shortages of food, for example, on the shutting down of crossing, on the lack of necessities and food for people, when at some point back in the day when I was in there, I was diagnosed with acute malnutrition with my toddler, which is the stage that precedes starvation as a result of the shortages of food that we had to navigate back then. So right now I'm in that kind of place where I have to keep moving forward and carrying the story and the legacy ahead, because these people trusted me with their stories, with their narratives, with their voices. And at the same time, I can't move ahead and just leave it behind, everything that I have left behind. It's a place where I call home, and it's really breaks my heart to see it, like, being um slipping out of attention, given the scale of the world kind of, dramas and conflicts, and the kind of the news cycles and everything that's happening all at once. Gaza is just one story. It's not the main story anymore. We have other tragedies around the world. We have other heartbreaks that are happening. We have other humanities and peoples and communities that are also being stripped out of their agency and voices. And so it breaks my heart to be able to navigate all of that, while at the same time keeping and trying to keep Gaza at my heart and at my job at the center of that and everything. Um, and so communication with people, it has been, I think, relatively easier somehow. There are parts in Gaza where communication was restructured. The infrastructure was a little bit put down to work um, in some certain areas in the strip where bombardment and destruction weren't really total or absolute. But still, it's really challenging for so many places, for so many people there, including journalists, to continue to have their presence online all the time, because movement is still restricted, mobility around Gaza is still restricted. The people are being pushed towards one part of the areas that are inhabitable right now, and they have like this red line that is provisionally supposed to be like a fixed strict red yellow line, sorry, that keeps shifting and changing places. And the people are having to navigate this kind of security measurement and moving around and just dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. So connection is easier somehow, but it's not totally feasible, and it's not really always safe all the time to get that connection.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Mohammed. These are really, really tough stories, and I appreciate your sharing them with us. I'd like to thank Mohammed and Nilu and Stephen for an excellent panel, sharing some really fascinating, difficult stories that they've been working on all over the world. Thank you all to our audience for joining us on this OPC panel. We'll be doing this again and hope to see you guys again. So thanks to all. We appreciate it.